amigos, amigas, buenas noches, buenas tardes, buenos días, maybe, depends on where you are in the world. My name is Vanessa Vasquez. I am your Lima City guide, and today we will continue with my From Home series. We're going to talk about one of the most difficult chapters, most bloody chapters of the history of Peru. And we're going also to try to understand the reasons why this terrible situation emerged in my country. So thank you so much for coming, by the way. And I really hope this event will not be interrupted with any problems of connection, but let me know if there is any issue with the internet or the voice. Well, anything that can disturb you, just let me know, please. Hola, Adrian. Oh, okay, Adrian, I will. No worries. I'm still waiting. I'm still waiting for the group to join. Let me know when I can do it. By the way, this is the sort of like a repetition. I'm repeating the event of the morning. I usually try to do these events the same day at different times, same event, because in that way I can reach out friends from different parts of the world. And this is mainly because I don't repeat these themes. I go to a different one next time. So, well, thanks a lot for coming and for your interest in Peruvian history. I'm sure most of you are not from Peru. Most of you are not from South America. So this is something really, really special for me to know that you are interested in these themes that are, in this case, controversial of the history of Peru. And what can be more controversial than the story of the terrorism in Peru? And controversial because the origin of this terrible internal conflict is connected also with a series of mistakes, of terrible internal organization since the colonial times. So this was just, like pass inside a womb that was awaiting for something to touch it, to profoundly to explode. Right? So, well, we're going to discover about the origins of the terrorism in Peru, and also what happened in the worst days of the terrorism, right? So he's ready. Oh, excellent, Adrian. So thank you, by the way, my friends, for joining, for connecting tonight. This is, as I said before, a repetition from my morning event. So if you were here in the morning as my friend Adrian, and you're trying to catch up again with it, thank you so much, by the way, in advance. So my name is Vanessa Vasquez. I am your Lima City guide, and I do different kinds of tours, from tours about like traditional street tours, walking tours in Lima. I do cooking classes with my brother here in my kitchen. By the way, we are here in my home. I do also tours about, let's say, different themes, like, for example, sunset tours. I do street art tours. I do all kinds of tours. Lima is such a melting pot, such a vibrant city. So a tour guide never gets bored in this city. And also, I'm taking the advantage of, these occasions of doing events from my home that will cover different themes. So today we're going to talk about the terrorism. And the terrorism in Peru is one of the most difficult themes to touch in my country, still for the people of my generation. And my generation in particular, I was born in the year 1983. So 1983, 1982, 1980 were the years when the terrorism started in Peru. And I was very little to remember the car bombs, to remember the horror, to remember the crimes. But I grew up in an environment in which the blackouts were very common, in which every time there was a blackout, people started to fear. I remember seeing adults in fear. Like, it was not, the fear of the darkness. It was the fear of what was causing that blackout and who will be killed that time. And I remember living that. I remember seeing candles in my kitchen. Like, there was always candle and also batteries for radios when the electricity was gone. And this even remembering this now gives me also that sensation of fear. But well, now those are days from the past. Still, of course, talking about terrorism is something we are very afraid of. Terrorism in Peru nowadays is not a threat anymore, which is very good news. But fighting terrorism, defeating terrorism, took a long time. So are you ready to start with this event? I really hope you are interested. You will be all interested all the way until the end. I have prepared a slideshow. So, well, let's start with this theme about the history of the terrorism in Peru. So here you can see, first of all, a little introduction. This is a theme that is part from my Controversial Themes of Peru series. I'm covering in this series different themes related from, let's say, characters of the history of Peru, like former presidents, for example, events, historic events that sometimes cause, like different feelings, different sensations that not everybody agrees in the same about them. So that's why I call this event also controversial. Why terrorism can be controversial? Because first of all, it can be controversial because many people, let's say, consider that terrorism was a response also to not years, actually, let's say hundreds of years of oppression in the Andes, right? And then a group of people that were so angry, so mad at the way how society treated them, that responded in this way, right? But also there are more controversial things that will be coming in a moment. So let's start with this part, which I think is very important. 80% of the victims of the terrorism in Peru had as mother language an indigenous language. So they did not speak Spanish, my language, the one that I learned here in the city. They spoke Quechua or Ashaninka. Quechua is the second most spoken language in Peru, although it's considered still a language rural because it is more used in the Andes, right? But this was the language used by the Incas as a frank language in the Incan times, and still is active nowadays. Ashaninka, in the other hand, which is also one of the most spoken languages in the jungle, it is not spoken as much as the Quechua. This also gives you an idea that the terrorism was not just concentrated in the Andes, it was also in the jungle. And the amount of killings caused by this fight was massive. We're going to go to that in a moment. So the terrorist group that caused all of these many lives in the country, that caused this terror, this fear, right, for a space of pretty much 20 years of active fight, but also ideologically, we have to talk about it, up to 40 years in our history. The name of this group is Sendero Luminoso. Sendero Luminoso, in English, the Shining Path, was a communistic group that emerged in the 60s. This time in the history of the communism in the world was very important because it's a historic time that is called the Sino-Soviet Split. Due to ideological differences, let's say, Soviet Union and also the People's Republic of China separated. No? All of the core, let's say, of this separation was because Russia was more like into being a little bit more progressist, like not cutting completely their relations with economical relations with other countries that were not communistic. China, in the other side, was more strict in terms of being isolated and not having relations with countries that were not communistic. So this was the biggest split in terms of communism, and that also affected the whole world. It affected all the world. All the groups that were partidarios, as we say in Spanish, or followers of these ideologies, were lost because they did not know which side to join, right? So in Peru, something very important happened. First of all, the communistic ideas and the communism in Peru is very old, by the way. In the also the period of the 1930s, more or less, is when communism became a more consolidated ideology and even political party, right? One of the most important thinkers of the socialism and the communism in Peru is José Carlos Mariátegui, a famous Peruvian writer that lived actually very short. He died when he was 35 years old. He wrote different essays, right? But his most famous was focused in the big differences between the people of the fields, the poor people, and the people of the cities. And he focused, he gave 7 theses or essays to give a solution to these problems. And these solutions were also very well identified with the communistic ideas, right? So this is why later on, many, many years after, Sendero Luminoso eventually was called like that, because originally Sendero Luminoso, this extreme communist group, was known as Bandera Roja. Bandera Roja is red flag, right? And they also emerged in Ayacucho, which is one of the poorest locations in Peru. We will talk a little bit more about this later. So the name of the newspaper of Bandera Roja was Por el Sendero Luminoso de Carlos Mariátegui, which means in English, through the shining path of José Carlos Mariátegui, right? Making very clear that they were following the ideology of Mariátegui, right? And now we have to go back in time to the period of the 60s, right? In particular, 1964, time when the Peruvian Communist Party split, divided in two. We are back into the time of the split between Russia and China, and there was not really consensus between all of these groups that initially were communist groups, but now some of them are being called Pequineses, and some other are being called Moscovitas, right? So some of them are pro the Soviet Union, some of them are pro the Chinese party, right? The Chinese, let's say, Maoist ideas, right? So the ones that were more sort of stick to the communist ideas of Mao, more connected with the popular fight, the fight using weapons, right, was, of course, the one that became Sendero Luminoso eventually, of course, right? So Sendero Luminoso, the Shining Path, is one of the different groups that emerged in Peru. There is also another very famous one that eventually we're going to talk about in another chapter of these controversial themes, the MRTA, the MRTA, which was more inclined to the Che Guevara, right? So they were more into that pathway. So they were different groups, right? Sendero Luminoso is considered to be the bloodiest of all of these groups that we had in Peru. And their field of action was initially the Andes. Why the Andes? And why particularly this location that I am marking in red color here? So first of all, the country, Peru, is a large country. It's a country of big divisions since the time of the conquest, the colonial era. The zones that are the most developed in Peru are usually the zones along the coast. For example, this is Lima, my city over here. This is Lima, the department. And also there are some Andean cities that are very, very developed. For example, Arequipa over here, or Cusco. It could be either because of the mining, also because of the tourism or the agriculture. But in general, most of the Andean and jungle cities are completely abandoned, even still nowadays in many forms, although things have changed a little bit after terrorism. And most of the income the country makes in those locations is related with the mining and the exploitation of the nature of those sites. So you can imagine that the exploitation of minerals, the only thing that has brought into these zones most of the times has been depredation, destruction, damage, destruction of the water sources, etc. But also historically, the indigenous of those territories were people with no opportunities, no education, because there were not even schools or universities nearby. So these were people, second-class citizens, that were in a permanent circle, or let's say, circle of poverty that could not leave behind. So these zones are so distant, so far away from the most developed zones that sometimes there were no police stations nearby. There were no schools. There were no authorities. These people were alone. And they were living in a state of isolation. That when Sendero meant for them, if you were having a problem, neighbor, who would ask for help? Usually a governor, right? But in those places, there was nobody. So the terrorists took the place of the government. And that's how they got into the heart of the indigenous. And eventually, they were loved and followed by many. They were sort of the Robin Hoods, right? And here we have to talk about Abimael Guzman, one of the most important characters of our story. Abimael Guzman Reynoso is the man who is pointed out as the absolute leader of the Shining Path, founder of this group as well, number one of this organization, known also as Presidente Gonzalo or President Gonzalo. That was his alias. He was a university professor of philosophy, and he taught philosophy in a university called Huamanga, in a zone, Ayacucho, that is considered one of the poorest locations in my country. It's extremely, extremely poor there, still nowadays, even after the terrorism. So he was not an extreme poor person, although he had his own personal issues. He was an abandoned son by his father. He dealt with different problems in his childhood. And he embraced the ideology of the communism in such a way that became his life entirely. He considered, his thought, his ideas very, very smart. He thought very highly of himself, actually, and he believed himself being equal to Karl Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Mao. That, well, actually, he admired a lot Mao Zedong. And he considered himself as well the fourth sword of the Marxism. He was considered by his followers at some point a demigod called Pucainti, or red god. Puca is red in Quechua, and it refers also to the color of the flag of the shining path. But also the students of this teacher that was seen sometimes as a crazy man called him Profesor Shampoo, which is very funny because it referred to the fact that he used to brainwash people, right? So that's why he was called Professor Shampoo. So he has also a very interesting story, which we're going also to talk a little bit about in a moment. Sendero Luminoso believed that the communism was betrayed by all the groups that were called by them revisionists, revisionistas. So the idea of Sendero was to go through the purest path of communism, and that any in-betweens, any negotiations, any relations that communist groups could have with, let's say, a free market, that was revisionism, right? And they did not want to go to walk that path. Also, here you have a picture of University of Huamanga, where Professor Abimael Guzman taught the course of, or the specialty of philosophy. And you can see also these painted walls in one of the classrooms. This is from back the days, in which we have lots of phrases related with terrorism. For example, this one you see over here is muerte a los soplones. Soplones is a word that was used a lot by terrorists to point out someone that was accusing them. Soplón, soplar is to blow, right? So to talk about what they were doing. Muerte is to kill, death to the soplones. Another phrase that calls my attention is this one, aprender del presidente Gonzalo. We have to learn from President Gonzalo, abajo el revisionismo, down the revisionism, right? So this was a university classroom. And in this environment, many students learned about the communism, the most extreme communism. And the plan that Abimael Guzman had was very, very smart, actually. Easy, smart, direct. He reached out, especially the faculties of education and sociology. There were also other faculties that were reached out, but especially those. And especially and in particular education. Why? Because if you reach educators, if you reach teachers, you will reach children. And that's what they wanted to. They were very patient in the beginning because they wanted to put this seed in those kids through their teachers to have an army that will help Guzman or Presidente Gonzalo to take the country. And this is the way how the schools look like back then in the rural zones of Peru. Where are the chairs? Where are the tables? Where are the books? Any notebooks? No. All of these kids going to school without any proper even clothes, walking for hours because they came from the farthest points of the vicinity, early in the morning. Imagine the cold mornings in the Andes to go to school. the teachers seeing these absolute differences between the Andes and the big cities, because many of them came from the big cities, reaffirmated their connections, their compromise with terrorism, with the communism that eventually became terrorism. Because it's impossible not to be touched, of course. So we have to, and that's why I call this a controversial series, because I want you to put in the position of everybody and understand how a terrorist group can emerge in such conditions. It was not from one day to another, of course, right? But you need a lot of people that are having so much like bitterness in themselves to think that what we have, the government we have, is not doing anything for you. It's not doing anything for the kids that are innocent, right? And you have big cities with lots of development, and you have this reality. This is one of the pictures that I found in the internet. There's so many more, and I invite you also to give a look to these pictures, easy now to find online. So, well, now we go to Abimael Guzman again, and how he advertised himself being this powerful supernatural entity. It's very interesting. Usually communism does not take, people by name, right? You are a unity with others, right? But sometimes you need a God. You need someone to follow. And that's the case of Presidente Gonzalo. I'm sure he copied lots of the posters, propaganda of Mao Zedong. And he replicated this here in his experience that he was trying to create. Defender la vida del Presidente Gonzalo. To defend, let's defend the life of Presidente Gonzalo. Viva el Maoísmo. Let's say, long life Maoism, right? So Sendero embraced this idea of the popular fight, or guerra popular. Right? So that's how we call it in Spanish, guerra popular, which was the same idea Mao Zedong had, right? That the people of the fields will take the weapons and will defend themselves, right? We have another poster here that to me, it makes me feel the same in terms of, Mao Zedong and also Abimael Guzman, right? These multicolorful posters were everywhere in the Andes where Sendero had presence, put everywhere, and nobody really cared back then. We're talking about the 60s, the 70s. So they were very well organized, but remember that there was a big abandonment of these faraway, remote locations. And this is also something really sad as well. How the government allowed this to go this big without caring, right? But the experience of Abimael Guzman was not the one of a peasant. He never plotted the land. He was not a man of the field. He was a well-educated man that even traveled to China in a point of his life to learn from the experience of Mao Zedong in the 60s. So he really didn't understood the details of the life of the fields. He understood it from the theory, not from the practice. And here we have some pictures of a very young Presidente Gonzalo, Abimael Guzman, and also these three members of the Permanent Committee or Comité Permanente of Sendero Luminoso that was formed in the year 1978. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these characters you see here. And it's also very important to notice that women had a very, very important presence in terrorism in Peru. For example, from just this picture, the permanent committee is organized by 2 women. Augusta Latorre was the number 2. She was also called Camarada Nora or Comrade Nora. And she was the wife of Abimael Guzman. They were married. The number 3 was Elena Iparraguirre, which escalated very fast also in the Sendero Luminoso as a very active, proactive, efficient person, and gained also the trust of Abimael Guzman, Augusta Latorre. And eventually something really incredible happened, because this picture also is not just showing a relation, a work relation between these 3. It also shows what many especially say it was a love triangle, in which Elena Iparraguirre fell in love of Abimael Guzman. And also the story gets so dark that there are informs that say and point out that Elena Iparraguirre poisoned Augusta Latorre and killed her. So the reasons of this murder are probably the profound love Iparraguirre had for Guzman. They were together for many years, and maybe Guzman really was interested in having something with her. And why we think so? Because few time after the passing of Augusta Latorre, Abimael Guzman started an official relation with Elena Iparraguirre. So that's why it's well known that probably she poisoned the wife of Abimael Guzman. But Guzman and Latorre got married when she was very young, so it was really an interesting couple, this one. They had a very big difference in ages for those days, especially quite common, but still for me nowadays considered big. She was underage. Of course, that being adult back then, you had to be 21 years old. Now it's 18 years old in Peru. But she was able to marry the man of her life, Guzman, because the father of Augusta Latorre was a friend of Abimael Guzman. She came from a communist family, a pro-communist family. And Guzman was a very good friend of her father. So that's how she was able to get married him. And together, they traveled to China. And in a sort of like boot camp. And they learned there, in these 2 years they were in China, in between 1965 and 1967, from creating bombs, right, pamphlets, fight, using guns, like all kinds of things you can learn on a boot camp of that time. This information they learned, they use it later in their fight. So here you can see some pictures of first Abimael Guzman in one of his last pictures, also in public, and also Elena Iparraguirre. As I said before, they united after the dying of the wife of Abimael Guzman, and they got married. So when terrorism started actively here in Peru, the beginning of the terror, of the fight, of taking the weapons of the Shining Path, Sendero Luminoso, that I also refer sometimes as SL, started in the year 1980. In May of that year, we were electing president. We had a long period of military presidents, and we were going back to the democracy. So people were called to vote. That was the time when Sendero believed it was a good opportunity for starting their racing, their fight. The person who won that election was Fernando Belaúnde Terry. Belaúnde Terry, which is known even nowadays, to be one of the most pacifist presidents of Peru. Also, one of the most beloved, because he's pointed out being one of the less corrupted presidents of our history. Can you imagine that? There are not proofs of corruption during his times. Also, we have a bittersweet remembrance of this president because of his inactions during the time of the terrorism. If we could have a time machine, we would be able to advise our president, Belaúnde Terry, to do so many changes. He was more focused in all the things than in terrorism, which was believed to be sort of like a little raising of rebels, right? Also, there was a time when it was the 1980s when we had a conflict with Colombia, and there was a fight also with Colombia for territories, for the borders. So this is why we were more focused in those fights in defense of the nation and the sovereignty of the country. So this picture is also very important because we know that the actions of Sendero happened in the Andes initially, in the mountains. But now Sendero felt so strong, so sure that they had enough power to fight, to confront the president and the government, that they decided to appear in Lima, my friends, the capital of Peru. And one morning also, we're still talking the year 1980, Lima woke up with dogs hanging from electric posts, from electricity or light posts in the street. And these dogs, which were hanging like the image you can see here, had signs in which was written Deng Xiaoping, or son of a bitch. So this phrase in Chinese, the specialists especially the Presidente Gonzalo or Abimael Guzman, believed that what he was trying to do was not just to send a warning to Peruvians, to Limanians, also to send a message to China, as saying, we will continue the fight here. Right? That's why he used Chinese. Mm-hmm. So this is officially the time of the armed conflict. Mm-hmm. So the names we give to this period of the history of Peru, of the terrorism in Peru, are many, my friends. We don't use only the word terrorism times. Mm-hmm. For example, the Commission of the Truth and Reconciliation that was formed in the 2000s, when we were now pacifying in that time the country, name this period of fights, internal fights, as conflicto armado interno. So internal armed conflict. Right? The militaries in Peru usually call this period between the 80s especially and the 2000s the subversive violence, violencia subversiva period, right? It is also known as guerra interna, internal war. But most Peruvians call this period terrorismo, terrorism. So officially, Sendero Luminoso, the Shining Path, is considered an organization that developed terrorist actions. Many people in Peru dislike the fact that we don't call things the way they are. Like we don't call them terrorist group. So sometimes this is also another controversial part, right? So the militants of Sendero did not use uniforms. They usually were located in rural zones, but also you could find them in the cities. The problem is that because they didn't use uniforms, they did not use just like bases outside the cities that you could find. it was very difficult to recognize them, right? So that was the very worst part of Sendero. And anyone could be a senderista. Senderista is a militant of Sendero. So it could be a maiden. It could be a cleaner. It could be, I don't know, a taxi driver, right? So it was terrible. The strategy that Sendero used in the highlands especially was what we call in Spanish, barrer el campo, which will be a literal translation to sweep the fields. So the idea was putting pressure, even sometimes killing, right, authorities, the few ones that we had there, to expel them, to make them run away, right, from the rural zones. For each person, for one person dying from the terrorists, in the terrorist fight, right, in the city, in the big city, 5 people died in the rural zones. So finally, the militaries took control in Peru. You know, first of all, President Belaúnde Terry underestimated the terrorists. He was more into other things. He was a pacifist. He didn't want the militaries to be involved. So he made the police to deal with the problem. The police were not able to do that. Many were killed also. So that's why finally, in the year 1982, after 2 years of not good effects, finally, a president decided that the military is getting control, right? So, well, it is very well known that the military forces did not get along well with the peasants, the indigenous, the people from the Andes, because they were too harsh, because they treat them very bad, because their ways were not like the ones of the people of the Andes. So instead of, making good friends with the peasants, it happened the opposite. Also, the military training they had made them feel suspicious of any person. Remember that, right? So they couldn't trust anyone. Also, another thing that it was, asked to Belaúnde was to arm the people of the provinces, the peasants, to give them weapons to defend themselves. As a pacifist, Belaúnde did not want to do that. He didn't want to add more wood to the fire. This is now the time we're going to talk about some examples of how terrible this internal war was. And the first example is the case Uchurajay that happened in 1983. By the way, 1983 is the year when I was born. So there were several horrible cases that happened in 1983. I don't know how my mom was able to deal with her pregnancy, having me, and also, waking up every day with a new terrible story. And this one was one of the worst stories that happened during those days. So Uchurajay is a community that nowadays will continue existing, but not with the big numbers of people used to live there. And this was also the case of a group of journalists, right, from Lima, a very well-known group of famous journalists that traveled to the Andes, to Uchurajay, to cover the news of this community that fought the terrorists. So the people of Uchurajay, they fought the terrorists directly. No, they decided to not give up. They took the bulls, right, from the horns, and well, the news spread over very fast. So the story is like this. This group of journalists went there to interview the people of the community. And here you can see, first of all, the picture of the 8 journalists that went there, even some of them very young. We had also some already very well known in the journalism in Peru, right? And these pictures you see here were made the day of their disappearance, right? And were discovered months after in a cave, the camera, with the pictures roll, the photographic roll in the camera, right? And these pictures were made by one of these journalists, right? So you can recognize, for example, this gentleman is this person. Here you can see this person, right? So let me tell you the story. It has been reconstructed like this. They got into the town of Uchurajay. The community leaders were, afraid of which people were this. They couldn't recognize who they were. They had an interpreter in Quechua, right? So it's most likely that they told them they were journalists, but they were not trusted. They were not believed. So these pictures that look that they are badly made actually are made minutes before they were killed by the people of the community. The people of the community, when they saw the cameras of these journalists, they confused those cameras with weapons. And they killed them all. They killed them with axes, with spears, with knives. This is the picture that when these bodies were recognized later, when they were discovered, this is the picture that went out to the news, because these journalists were disappeared for so long, right? So terrible to imagine that these people were just trying to get to reach these people of the community, and also the people of community were afraid of these journalists because they believed they were terrorists, because few days before they killed a terrorist. So they believed the terrorists were after them, right? We have another terrible case, Lucanamarca. So the first one was people of the community afraid, killing also other innocent. Lucanamarca is the most famous case of a killing in a community caused by Sendero Luminoso. SL is Sendero Luminoso, or the Shining Path. 69 peasants were killed by the Sendero Luminoso, and because they were supporters of the military, supporters of the peace, right? Supporters of, continue their lives the way they used to be, right? So they were killed as an exemplar way to say the rest of the communities to stick to the fight of the people, right? We have also other two cases, Cayara, and Socos. So Cayara and Socos, which are also names of communities, were also terrible cases because in these two cases, nor the terrorists kill, nor the very people of the community kill. We have militaries and police that kill the people of the communities, thinking they were terrorists and they were innocent people, right? So we were in a crossfire. You could not trust anyone. Imagine living like that. Imagine those terrible days. Who you can trust. Imagine also the traumas that so many kids receive from their parents. And we have an example of resistance. We have Mama Helika. Mama Helika is known as the symbol of the resistance. She never stopped looking for her son, who disappeared in the year, once again, 1983. So the son of Angelica, Archimedes, was an honest, good boy, young boy, that had nothing to do with the terrorists. One day, someone knocked the door of her house. It was the militaries. She opened the door, they got in, and they took Archimedes to the comisaria, or the police station, they said. She said, he's innocent. He said, I'm innocent. And he still was taken. And in the desperation, of the insistence of this mother, the military said, come tomorrow to the police station and we are going to give your son back. We are just going to interrogate him. Next morning, she went to the police station with clothes and food for her son. Nobody could say where he was. She continued going over and over every day and more mothers appeared looking for her sons. All of them disappeared. She organized or created an organization, an association of families of the people kidnapped by the militaries, my friends. And that these people never appear in most of the cases. Or if they appear in mass graves, right? She also helped to raise funds for the children of the men disappeared and helping the wives of these men disappeared. So she was never able to find the body of her son. She had to die without knowing exactly where her son was. So the victims of the armed conflict of Peru between the year 1980 and the year 2000 were approximately 70,000. 70,000 people who disappeared, who died and were later found on mass graves. People that we don't know where they are buried, and that had families awaiting for them. Here, just to mention some few last words about the worst genocide of the history of Peru, Abimael Guzman Reynoso, leader of the Shining Path, the terrorist group, who was captured in the year 1992. He died last year in prison in the year 2021 at age 86. He died believing that he did good to the country, because he said that without his fight, the government would never look in direction to the Andes and the necessities of the poor people. So this story today was a controversial story, and I'm sure you're going to have different opinions about this story, but something that I want to close with is the fact that we're talking about so many innocent people that just wanted to have, a peaceful life. They wanted to raise their kids. They wanted to, to see their wives, their husbands, to have a normal life. And all of their dreams were taken away by a fight that they didn't choose, right? So I really hope you enjoyed this event. You learned this from this event. Well, it's hard to enjoy from the story, but I hope you found it interesting, and also that it opened for you a new window into the history of South America, the history of Peru. It has been also a pleasure for me to share this story, although it is hard to talk about these wounds, but it's important to never forget, because if we forget, we make the same mistakes. It's human nature to do that. And it's our duty, our job. We people that are in tourism, tour guides, historians, archaeologists, all people, you voyagers, to dig in the story, to learn from this story, and never permit people forget again, right? So thank you so much, my friends. Gracias, Dorota. Gracias, Larry. Gracias, Deborah, for your tip support. You know how important this is for us to continue this. Well, now we're called content creators, right, in Hego. So for us content creators, us guys, to have this as a fuel for continuing with these different events that we are doing, which are all for free. And also with your tip support, we are able to help Hego to keep growing as well. So Deborah, thank you so much for coming, my friend. Gracias, thanks for your visit. Gracias, Molly. Thank you, gracias, Pamela. I'm so happy that you were able to learn something new from this. You told us about your terror as a child. Yes, Adrian. The blackouts when I was little, I remember having this fear of the bombs, of the You know, sometimes the bombs were nearby, so the windows, they had tape, right? Usually we have tape in seismic zones, but back in those days, it was because of the movements of the car bombs. So my mom and my grandma, they used to hug me, and they used to tell me stories also to sleep well, because it was such terrible, terrible time. And as a child, sometimes you transform these stories, these events. So because I remember my grandma and my mother, they used to tell me stories, fantastic stories, every time there was a blackout. So they wanted to compensate the fact that there was no electricity, right? So, well, this is a little bit of my personal story. So thank you so much for coming. If you would like also to support this channel, gracias Pamela, gracias Molly. If you would like to support this channel, I will activate a button over here that will guide you, help you into how you can support with a little donation, if it's in your possibilities, of course. You are always welcome to my events. You are always welcome to my house, to my kitchen, to my street tours at any time. Is Sendero Luminoso a still existing group? Dorota, yes, Sendero Luminoso still exists. But Sendero is not considered a threat anymore. They are mainly active now in the jungle, and they have reinvented themselves now into a more like a narco-terrorist group. They subsist, they live from narco traffic. So this is how they were able to continue existing. But they are a very small number, very reduced number. And the government indeed learned from the past example of, you know, what happens when you abandon your people. So now we have more education and schools, but still we are, you know, like not there yet. So we have to learn a lot. Muchas gracias, amigos. Thank you so much. If you would like to follow my Heigo channel, here you have my Heigo channel, the link to the Heigo of your guy Vanessa here in Lima. You can also click the button follow in the upper part to see more events. Tomorrow I have an event about history, colonial history. We will talk about the first mestizos, the mixed blood children of the Spanish, and we're going to learn a lot of things about this theme. So you're all invited. I have a cooking class also tomorrow, so please come. You have all my information here. So I hope to see you in my Facebook group, in the Heigo Voyagers group, in my future tours. So, well, have a lovely evening, lovely rest of the day. Take care. And lots of love from your friend and guide in Lima, Peru, Vanessa. Have a wonderful, wonderful night. See you soon. Bye-bye.